Hi, hello and welcome everybody. Hopefully people have got their audio settled, but if not, I will type all of this out for you if you're still waiting on that or for people that are coming in late. But welcome to today's webinar on digital accessibility best practices. Before I introduce our panel today, I just wanted to briefly go over the functionality of this particular platform. I'm sure by this point, you're all very used to virtual meeting software. And there's just a few key differences here with webinar as opposed to meeting. The first is if you use the chat feature, which we ask if people use it, it's mostly just for discussion or side commentary. If you want everyone to see your message, make sure that you select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu. Otherwise, it will just be seen by us as the panel. So you can also send private chats there if you would prefer. If you have a question for the panel, there's two ways you can ask that. The first is text-based, and you can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your webinar dashboard there. You can ask those questions anonymously, but other people can view them, they can upvote them, and they can add their own comments. And then finally, since we're going to have a little bit of a smaller audience today, we can get a little more personal with a Q&A. So if you'd like to speak, you can just raise your hand. And during the Q&A period, I will go in and unmute you. So those are your three main options for interacting with us today. So appreciate you joining. So moving on, obviously this is about digital accessibility. We have two excellent presenters joining us today to talk about their institutional perspectives in this important area and to kind of guide you along with any questions you might have as you improve your own accessibility on campus. So to start with, we have Naomi Porber from the University of Colorado Boulder. Hi, Naomi. And then we have Ellen Clark from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hi, Ellen. So I'll hand it off to Ellen and we'll get started here right now.
Thank you, Mike. To start, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the agenda that we'll be following today. As Mike mentioned, we're going to be talking about digital accessibility best practices, and we're going to kind of guide you through that by first starting talking about what digital accessibility is, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper and talk about the difference between usability and accessibility, because those two terms are very frequently used together. So we'll just talk a little bit more about the differences. And then we'll talk about the components and forms of accessibility, what goes into making something accessible and how accessibility can look in a digital space. And then we'll talk about the application of digital accessibility and how to apply it. We'll also talk about specific examples with each of our institutions on how we've used digital accessibility, and we'll provide some examples there. And then there will be time for a wrap up where we'll address some of your questions and then also provide you with some resources. And so with talking about questions, we wanted to let you know that please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation using any of the ways that Mike had talked about at the beginning. But additionally, we wanted to make this a little bit interactive. And so you'll see this symbol of a brain on some of the slides in certain areas. And those will be areas where we'll want to prompt you to think about some questions or just think about what we're talking. So we may be asking you a few questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to submit those answers in the chat as well, just to kind of keep you guys engaged with our content. And so knowing all of that, I'll hand it over to Naomi to start us talking about what digital accessibility is.
Great, thanks so much, Ellen. So to kick things off, we thought we'd just start and pose that question to you. And there's that little brain that Ellen mentioned. But by posing the question to you all, what some words or phrases that come to mind for each of you when you hear the word accessibility? And feel free to pop that in the chat. We understand that for some folks, this may already be an area where you have a degree of knowledge or expertise, but for others, you may not have engaged with the subject that much. So either way, would be interested to get a little bit of a sense of what comes to mind for each of you when you hear the word accessibility or think about accessibility concerns. right, I'm not seeing too much come in, so maybe we have a shy group today, which is also fine. Oh, Ellen, screen readers is something that comes to mind for you. Something that often comes up for folks is just really that word access, which makes a lot of sense. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But again, so we're focusing on digital accessibility today. And again, thinking about access, how we access digital spaces, tools, and resources. So on the next slide, one of the definitions that we use when thinking about digital accessibility is just looking at audiences of any level being able to, of any ability level or disability, are able to perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with your digital content. So again, about that access piece, access for all, and keeping in mind a diversity of abilities. So considering auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, or visual abilities. And before delving too much more into the what, wanted to pause for a moment to discuss more of the why. So thinking about why should I care about digital accessibility? And there are a couple of reasons that come to mind for us. So the first one, it is the law. So CU Boulder received a Department of Justice inquiry in 2014, an investigation under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which was initiated on behalf of students with blindness or low vision. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Additionally, at UW-Madison, their web accessibility policy requires compliance with the Federal Rehabilitation Act's Section 508, and looks to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 for guidance in meeting campus accessibility commitments. So again, one reason to care about digital accessibility, it's the law. There are also really broad impacts when it comes to digital accessibility. So according to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults have a disability that impacts major life activities. And disability becomes more common at different stages of life. So it affects 2 in 5 adults ages 65 and over. So at some point in their lives, most people will either have a disability or know someone living with one. Another reason why should I care about digital accessibility is that we really see it as it's the right thing to do, and it's an equity issue. And particularly when thinking about the web, which is all about providing access to as many people as possible. And as institutions of higher learning, it is really critical that universities adapt and remove barriers that keep individuals of all ability levels from gaining access. So that's a little bit of the why for us. And along similar lines, accessibility supports social inclusion for all people. So another one to look at this through is both folks with disabilities as well as temporary disabilities, changing abilities, and situational limitations. So we have some examples popped up here as well, but I'm curious for you as you think about this, what are some other examples that might come to mind for you? A time that you or someone you know may have experienced a temporary disability, a changing ability, or other situational limitation, especially throughout the last 6 months. The slow internet one may be one that some of us are familiar with in different spaces and have works, necessities have changed. On top of all these reasons, there's also a strong business case for prioritizing digital accessibility. So again, on top of compliance, that it has a broad impact, that it's the right thing to do. But digital accessibility best practices really go hand in hand with responsive design, improved usability, and can dovetail with search engine optimization efforts. So addressing digital accessibility helps not only individuals, but also businesses and society, as well as people not living with a disability. So really a win-win-win. And next, we're going to talk a little bit about usability relative to accessibility. And these are terms that, that you may be familiar with, but just wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the definitions here, again, because they're often used interchangeably or sort of together. So if we could go to the next slide, with some definitions up here. So looking at accessibility and addressing discriminatory aspects relating to equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with websites and tools. It also means that they can contribute equally and without barriers. And these are definitions from the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is noted towards the bottom there. They have a lot of great resources. Usability, by contrast, is about designing products to be effective, efficient, and satisfying. Usability includes user experience design, which may include general aspects that impact everyone and do not disproportionately impact people with disabilities. Usability practice and research often does not sufficiently address the needs of people with disabilities. So while there is substantial overlap here, neither is fully comprehensive on its own, which brings us to, on our next slide, to also consider inclusion, which is really about diversity and ensuring involvement of everyone to the greatest extent possible. And in this context, it can also be referred to as universal design or design for all, but really addressing a broad range of issues beyond ability, including computer literacy, economic situation, education, geographic location, culture, age, language, access to hardware, software, or internet connectivity. But in some ways, thinking about inclusion really comes down to thinking about who's in your audience and thinking about unchecked assumptions. So what assumptions we all have about who's interacting digitally with your office and how they find what they need. And there could be a full further presentation on any of these related subjects on the slide. And we understand many of you may be familiar with some of these concepts. We'll touch on several of these later as well. But for now, just additional factors to keep in mind in considering broader inclusion in tandem with digital accessibility efforts. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Ellen.
Great, thank you, Naomi. So now that we have a good base for information and fully kind of understand accessibility, usability, and everything that can be defined as accessibility, we're going to talk a little bit more about the components and forms of accessibility. And these are how accessibility and information is presented in a digital space. More accurately, forms of accessibility are a sub-component of the components of accessibility, which we'll get to right now. So components of accessibility are the things that come together to make a digital space accessible. You can think about these as the tools that are used to make a digital space accessible. In order for accessibility to occur, all of these components need to work together. And I want to point out that those listed on this slide and the ones that I'll talk about are not where it stops and starts. There are many more components that can go into digital accessibility, especially depending on the digital space that you're referring to. So I'll start with content and forms. So like I said, forms are a subset of the components, and forms of accessibility really are the content. And this is the information that's in a digital space. So we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but it can talk about the text, the images, the layout, anything that can be referred to as content in a digital space. Assistive technologies are things such as screen readers, alternative keyboards, switches, scanning software, anything that might be used by an audience member to assist them in engaging with a digital space. User knowledge is another component, and this is any knowledge or information that an audience member comes into your digital space with. This really affects accessibility, because if someone comes in to your site expecting to see one thing and it's presented in a different way than they're normally used to, the user knowledge is really the base that people have and what they expect. And so your site can decrease in its accessibility if it doesn't quite line up with what a user is anticipating. Authoring tools are the software that is used to create a digital space, and many authoring tools actually have built-in accessibility, but as we'll talk about later, it's really good to do a multi-pronged approach to evaluating your authoring tools and your digital space to make sure that it is accessible. And then there's evaluation tools. This is a crucial component of accessibility, is not only evaluating once, but continuously evaluating how your space is accessible and how people are interacting with your space. And as mentioned with authoring tools, we'll talk about the different types of evaluation. But so these are the tools and components that go into making a digital space accessible. So now that we know about that, we'll talk a little bit about the forms of accessibility, which, as I stated, is the content component of accessibility. So if we could go to the next slide, great. So like I said, these are the content that's on your website, are the forms of accessibility. And as with the previous slide, what's listed here is not an exhaustive list. It's not the start and stop of the forms of accessibility. There are many other forms of accessibility, especially given the varying digital spaces. So we're going to go over a few examples of how to make each of these forms accessible. But I'll only be touching on layout, image, and text. And as you can see, there's that brain image. So if while I'm talking about these, you guys want to think about audio and how audio can be accessible, I'll just touch on 3 of these so we can see how the forms of accessibility can be applied. So for layout, an easy thing to think about is using a linear logic in your digital space, especially in our culture. People are used to having their eyes follow a left to right, top to bottom. So making sure that your layout is not all over the place, but rather follows a linear form makes it more accessible. Ensuring that people can navigate your layout using only a keyboard is another great step. Building consistent and simple layouts. So making sure if we're talking about a website, all of your pages have a similar layout. That's another way to implement accessibility. And then considering mobile viewing. This is more and more prevalent, as I'm sure you all are aware, but making sure that your content can easily be used in a mobile view, especially thinking about the visually impaired who might be using a mobile view and how they'd interact with the space. For images, some things that can easily be thought about for ensuring accessibility are alternative text, using good color contrast, and with that, thinking about varying levels of color blindness, not just the most popular red-green color blindness, but other types of color blindness as well. And additionally, thinking about graphics or other things and not using color to convey meaning and having other ways aside from the image that people are receiving the information. With text, often in our world, I'm guilty of it as well. I get really wrapped up in I know what I'm talking about, but not everyone does. So avoiding jargon and using plain language are 2 ways to think about accessibility within text. It's really important, kind of going back to what Naomi was talking about, not just thinking about physical disabilities and making sure your spaces are accessible, but making sure your information and the content on your site is accessible includes making sure everyone of any age and any knowledge can understand what you're trying to convey, especially when we're asking our audiences to do something. So with that, now we know the components and the forms of accessibility. So I feel like we've established a pretty good base knowledge of what accessibility is and isn't and how it can look. And so we're going to move a little bit more into digital accessibility application and where we see it in our institutions and how we approach it. So go ahead, Naomi.
Great, thanks. So as I mentioned, just as we hop over into a few examples of digital accessibility application. So one construct to leverage here is the idea of the inverted pyramid. So this is something that's used in journalism and mass communications as a way to illustrate how information should be prioritized and structured. And this has implications for accessibility and usability as well. So it's about starting with the most critical information at the top. The premise here is you really have a few seconds to hook your readers and make it obvious whether your content is relevant to them, on average about 2 seconds. For people to assess if they're skimming a page or a message or even a subject line. Does this apply to me? What am I supposed to do? And so part of what this framework is designed to get folks thinking about is to lead with that essential information that the reader needs to make a decision: the who, what, where, and the when. And then for additional details and general information, nuance, exceptional circumstances, information that's nice to have, but not always necessary at the very top, to have that be further down, again, whether it's on the page, the email, anywhere else that, that your content lives. And this really goes hand in hand with the concept of cognitive load, as well as cognitive overload. So for example, what if a student is in a stressful situation and is trying to access information, or what if they're in a rush? Again, just for each of us, thinking of a time when you might be in a stressful situation and struggling to find the information that you need, when something's right in front of us, but we're, again, in a stressful or emergency situation, we might not see it right away, and just how we can think about making certain things front and center. And so this also keeps in mind a diversity of cognitive abilities. So again, which includes, but is really not restricted to people with related disabilities. And this takes into account the idea that the understanding of information is heavily influenced by the way that content is presented to the viewer. So again, leading with the essentials, additional information lower down. Another consideration here is to think about the user experience and trying to simplify the user's path to the goal as much as possible. So too much information concentrated in the same place may not be ideal. This is for many of us as we're processing things, these big dense paragraphs, and again, in times of cognitive overload, but also for someone using a screen reader. It takes a longer time to access information through these tools, different options for skimming. And so being able to pretty quickly assess if this information applies to you, or if you're even on the right page at the top, can go a long way to improved user experience. And part of this ties into some of the pieces that Ellen referenced as well. So adopting clear standards, and using patterns, so things like buttons for a call to action, a resources block on a website that looks the same and is found on the same spot, let's say a side panel on each web page on your site. This also helps folks just follow and find clear patterns quickly in what they're looking for. And another way to do this is guiding users with a clear beginning, middle, and an end. So start here, or big arrows, or steps to complete, 1, 2, 3. And then again, those optional resources available, but not necessarily front and center if not required for folks to take action and to know if it applies to them. And some other examples from Ellen.
So Naomi gave us some great ways to start thinking about it, especially broadly, and using that inverted triangle. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some ways to think about it in a stepwise fashion, or some more concrete steps that maybe can be thought about. So like Naomi said, making sure users succeed the first time, that idea of the inverted triangle and people knowing exactly what they're supposed to do and having that most important information really forward is a great point. Another point that I thought of while Naomi was talking about clickable buttons and calls to action is a form of accessibility with those is making sure that you give the buttons enough space so people can really be as accurate as possible, or they don't have to be so precise when they're clicking on buttons. I just thought about that as an example of accessibility that maybe isn't as frequently thought of. But then designing and building for change. I feel like this is really relevant right now as we're seeing so much change happen. By designing and building for inevitable change, you're almost automatically preparing yourself for an accessible platform. This goes back to what we were talking about of making sure your layouts are simple and your content is understandable. That also goes hand in hand with designing and building for change. And then, as I mentioned earlier, those evaluation tools and evaluating authoring tools is a really important step to ensuring accessibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to an example, but making sure that you're testing frequently and often is really important. And so you can use concrete or anecdotal information. Really, evaluating can take many different forms. So I'm going to talk about automatic, installed, and manual evaluation of accessibility. So many platforms like PDFs or Word documents have automated accessibility checkers, and they provide an extra layer of precaution. It's a really great place to start to see if there's an automated accessibility checker, but these won't catch everything, but it's a great way to find and pinpoint those broad alerts of where accessibility isn't. Then there are some installed plugins that you can use. I have one that I use to check our web space called WebAIM Wave. And it just pinpoints accessibility points. Again, these won't catch everything, but they will be able to catch a lot of things. Additionally, there are plugins for color contrast and checking to see what your site looks like in a mobile view. So they're just, again, another layer. And then lastly, self-checking and manual checking is probably the best way. Having someone that's not necessarily familiar with your content or your digital space, checking it for you and maybe providing them with a specific task, like can you complete X, Y, and Z from our homepage, is a really great way to manually check and see where some people might be tripping up in your site or see what might not be accessible. Self-checks can also include understanding Google Analytics for your site or any other form of analytic and seeing where people are stopping in the progress to completing an action. That can really tell you, oh, I need to look at this page, maybe it's not accessible to everyone. So that's another form of self-check, is using that more concrete data, the analytical data. And then similar to designing and building for change is making a plan for being offline. Again, something that we might be seeing with people not necessarily having the greatest internet access. Can people still get the information that they want to if they can't be online? By ensuring and designing and building for change and making a plan for being offline, you get very close to as accessible as you can be. So providing different ways for people to ingest your content and your forms of accessibility is a really great way to easily kind of plan for and make your space accessible. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is being open and encouraging engagement, being open to feedback on your site, knowing where your strengths lie and that you don't represent your entire population that's going to be viewing this space is really important. Others are going to catch what you might not catch. And then I know for sure I don't represent every single audience member that views the content that we present. So relying on those other people and being open to the feedback that they give and really engaging with those people when they might be struggling to understand why is a vitally important step to making sure that your digital spaces are accessible. And again, a really easy thing, I think, to implement. And so with that, Naomi and I are going to give you guys a couple of examples from our institutions and some key takeaways from our examples on how we've encountered digital accessibility and hopefully improved digital accessibility at our institutions. And so I'm going to provide an example, but as I provide it, I want you all to know the takeaway is to be proactive in accessibility implementation and consider accessibility at the beginning of your projects and all the way through. So test often and set reminders for yourself to check and make sure something's accessible. In the example that I'm going to provide about our website's navigation, accessibility wasn't really considered until the project finished and people were reporting that there were issues. So it's we're now doing that step of being open and encouraging feedback because we weren't proactive in including accessibility. So it's an easy thing to just kind of ping yourself and set a reminder, or maybe have an accountability partner saying, hey, have you thought about this? So with that, I'm going to talk about our website's navigation and what it looks like. So for a little bit of history, that I inherited our website. I came to UW-Madison about 1.5 years ago. And prior to me coming on board, the university had transitioned from one web hosting software to now we use WordPress. And so a project position was created for someone to transition our entire website, all the information, content, everything from this old software platform to WordPress. And because of many constraints, mainly time and the pressure to get it done, accessibility really couldn't be thought of. It was more of a, we need to transition all of this as fast as we can. Let's just transition it exactly how it is. So it ended up being a little bit more of a copy and paste situation. That by no means is exactly what happened, but for ease of understanding, it tended to be a copy and paste situation rather than critically thinking about the content and how we're presenting it and making sure that it's presented in an accessible way. Namely, our navigational structure, which we're currently in the process to improve, includes tertiary menus. So as you can see, there are some arrows here. There's the main navigation, and then it drops down to an incredibly long list of options, which then has a drop down within it. So that's kind of the 1, 2, 3 of the menu structure and how it takes 3 steps to even get to a page that you're looking for. If I was someone who needed to use any assistive technology, specifically easy to think about as a screen reader, that's a lot of options to hear read out until I get to what I want to, and then you have to click to expand. And so not all sub options. So for example, here it shows graduation, commencement, and conferral date. Those might not expand for someone using a screen reader. So they've now missed out on these 7 pages or page options that are underneath that sub menu. And so we're really thinking about how we can structure our menu, and like Naomi referenced, help people succeed the first time they come to our site. And this is also noted in our page views. The pages where people have to search a bit more are not necessarily being viewed as much as we'd like to have them be viewed. And that is attributed to how difficult we're making it for users to find the information. And so that's an example of, we weren't able to proactively implement accessibility practices because we needed the transition to happen so quickly, and maybe because it just wasn't being thought about as much. So from my own personal experience and having to now kind of redo an entire website, proactively and constantly checking in your processes to make sure accessibility is included is my takeaway from this presentation for you all. And with that, I'll hand it over to Naomi for her example.
Great, thanks, Ellen. So to echo Ellen a bit, I mean, being proactive is a huge piece for us at CU Boulder as well, and incorporating accessibility not just as an afterthought, but as baked into the project plan or as a consideration early in the process makes a huge difference in the total amount of work done on the project in the end, even if it's in a different order, as Ellen's referencing now, doing a lot of that cleanup work. Although similarly, so this is not a one and done action, and I know that the same is true at UW-Madison, but considering accessibility on the onset is critical, but and part of my personal responsibility as a communications professional with the Office of the Registrar is at CU Boulder is to consider accessibility across all the ways we communicate. But there's a lot that each of us can do throughout, which in my example that I'm going to talk about a little bit, really includes leveraging on-campus expertise as available. And sorry, yeah, if we can stay there for now for a minute. Thanks, Mike. So leveraging the on-campus expertise, and I'll talk a little bit about how we got there too, as mentioned earlier in the presentation. But what CU Boulder's Digital Accessibility Office recommends is really a 3-pronged approach. They recommend that folks educate ourselves. So best practices really continue to evolve here, and that it's important to be an advocate on our team for considering accessibility and user experience throughout the project. And again, we continue to seek out new information, and it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert and know every single, have absorbed everything in this presentation and any others that you've attended to be able to raise those questions. It's that continuing education piece, but just being able to be in the room and ask like, hey, has someone thought about this? Can really go a long way, especially if it's early in that process. So that's the first prong that our Digital Accessibility Office recommends. And using those built-in system tools that Ellen mentioned earlier. So these do have their limitations, but they continue to improve. The automated accessibility checkers won't catch everything, but will flag common issues and how to fix, like alt text for images, heading levels, color contrast, tabbing, et cetera. So in Microsoft Word and Adobe, some of these tools can really be a big help to get part of the way there. And then that third prong that our campus talks about is leveraging the on-campus resources. So at CU Boulder, our Digital Accessibility Office, they offer a digital accessibility testing lab. So one way that we've worked with them is to test out the user experience of using a form when the campus switched to a new online form platform. And what is this user experience using a screen reader? And so they go through in the testing, and then they provide a report noting any barriers and recommendations to remediate functional issues or points of barriers for folks. And relatedly, as a communications team, we work with developers to consider accessibility from the onset, but being able to have that campus level resource and that expertise to do that thorough check with those tools is really a huge asset that is a big value add for us. Also, Campus Web Team on our campus, they provide an annual training on digital accessibility best practices and considerations that specifically apply to the campus web platform that we use, Web Express. So specifically some of the built-in tools and features already vetted at the campus level. And as they roll out new functionality, those are some of the things that they highlight. So that's something, again, that we're encouraged to sort of leverage that on-campus resources that are available. But speaking of that on-campus expertise, and to take a step back on how we got here, it wasn't always this way at CU Boulder. So again, mentioned early on in the presentation, that Department of Justice inquiry several years back in 2014. And as a campus, it was made apparent that CU was in practice falling short of its goal related to accessibility. The stated goal was to create and foster an environment that ensures people with disabilities acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as persons without disabilities in an equally effective and inclusive manner with substantial ease of use. And we weren't really quite there yet in practice. So in response to this inquiry, the university convened staff from disability services, IT, legal, to analyze the cited gaps, to audit, document, and remediate these gaps. And some of the initial outcomes of going through that process was a new centralized accessibility website, a new accessibility of information and communication technology policy in 2015, accessibility review board, and those pieces were sufficient to lead to the closing of the Department of Justice investigation in 2015. But there's been a lot of work in the time since. So a renewed commitment as a university to addressing these cited issues, which were not new, but had been brought to the forefront. And this helped to foster a culture of accessibility, continuous improvement, and investment in communication technologies. And so this was before I started into my current role at CU Boulder, but my colleagues referenced this investigation as not necessarily being a bad thing in the end. The crisis point drove learning and growth and produced buy-in and resources at the leadership level on campus. Something else that this highlighted for folks is the importance of grounding the approach in ethics and morals, not just compliance. So it's not just, again, a box to check at the end, as we've said, and it's more than just risk management. And it really ties back into that why should I care question. So again, legal is a piece of that, but if folks are thinking, oh, that's the only reason to consider digital accessibility, then that can look a little bit different than if folks really see it as part of the responsibility as folks working in higher ed and making sure folks have equal access to content. Another takeaway here was just that executive buy-in really played a huge role in the success and being able to support and really prioritize these efforts on our campus. And this made possible these additional resources and this commitment to continuing improvement and inclusion. So enabled the university to be more proactive, to minimize the needs for case-by-case accommodations. All products must be tested and approved by the accessibility usability labs. And those labs are fully staffed and have capacity and resources. New campus personnel and services to support these efforts. And then any new contracts with vendors or contract renewals require accessibility language to be baked in to those contracts. So one vendor that we used We just have a screenshot on the next slide for our university catalog. So when our office took on CU Boulder's annual catalog publication cycle 4 years ago, a transition from our central comms unit at the university, our office had some accessibility conversations early in the process with the vendor and building that into the implementation plan. So easy navigation, consistent formatting, site architecture, and really part of the vendor selection process, even a step before that, was sort of looking for vendors that were well-versed in accessibility best practices and could answer the questions that we had around those items. But again, not one and done, so we continue to refine and revisit this each year. One example of an accessibility consideration for us with the catalog is we have this sortable programs A to Z section where folks can select different majors or minors or look at different levels and see the program options. And we have had different designs in mind, and the vendor has even talked about other ways that some other schools have laid this out, but those other options to date have not met our accessibility standards, and so we've held off on redesigning that page and focused on other enhancements for now, since that is sort of a something that we would need to assess before moving forward there. And with that, I think back to Ellen.
Great. Okay, so now we're gonna just wrap up with a few closing remarks, and then we'll get to any questions that you guys have. I feel like, as we've touched on several times in this presentation, it's important to remember that digital accessibility is an ever-evolving concept and plays hand in hand into equality and inclusion, which we should all, I think, be talking a bit more about right now, and accessibility is a big part of that. The sentiment and concepts presented will maintain similar over time, but implementing how you implement these things in a digital space may change, especially as technology evolves as well. This, we hope, provides a decent base knowledge, but there are many more resources that are available. As Naomi stated, check with your university and leverage university expertise, as well as leveraging your audience. They're the people that are consuming your content, so it's really easy to maybe check with a couple of people just to see what they're thinking about it and if they have any ideas. Lastly, I really want to maybe point out that we don't always think about it, but you encounter digital accessibility every single day, whether this is receiving emails that are using plain language, avoiding jargon, and spelling out acronyms that we use that we think everyone knows but may not know, reading PDFs that are accessible, even virtual meetings, having transcripts available afterwards or closed captioning. So digital accessibility really is something that we encounter every day. And hopefully this presentation provided a base for you guys to maybe see where digital accessibility happens in your lives on a day-to-day basis. Naomi, do you have any other closing thoughts that you'd like to add?
I think you summed it up perfectly. Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, and I guess we'll just move on next to see, what questions folks might have.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you both very much for sharing your perspectives and sharing a bunch of best practice. And as you were going through, I think it's clear that one of the other reasons that you should care is that, accessible design is just plain good design, leading with all the information you need up front, making things clear and navigable. Doesn't just help those that might have trouble in general accessing things digitally, but just everybody in general. I know, at least on ACRO's website, and I'm sure pretty much everybody that might view this, they have similar problems with their site that they're aware of where people can't find things. So something to keep in the forefront, probably at all times. And so while we wait for questions to come through, and again, you can put those in the Q&A or you can put any comments you have in the chat. Bringing it back, I guess, to the registrar's profession. So both of you work in communications. I'm not sure in that capacity whether you handle both external and internal communications and take a kind of a lead on accessibility there. But since registrars do a lot more internal, what in your experience is something that could be improved from that specific area, the records and registration area?
So I can go off of a personal example, I guess, and maybe one that is kind of easy to think about is with internal communications. Emails are kind of what comes to mind the most, and acronyms, especially. When I first started, I was immediately put in a meeting that I had no idea what was going on, and then all these acronyms were being thrown around, and I had to keep messaging my boss saying, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I ended up creating a list of acronyms that now gets handed out to all new staff as kind of a base knowledge. And then emails, especially thinking about people that might have more historical knowledge of things that have happened or policies or guidelines. And those content experts that are really passionate about their work and wanting to communicate everything that's involved, communicating to people that may not have as much base knowledge, or the user knowledge as a component is lesser than the people that are content experts. So for me, I think about emails immediately with internal communications, and making those more accessible, and avoiding jargon, using plain language, and trying to spell out acronyms or supplying a resource for that.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add, Naomi?
Sure. Yeah, the first thing that came to mind for me too is plain language, and I think so acronyms for sure, but also in the context of, there are some, whether it's due to systems or procedures, there are certain things that maybe can seem like they're fairly complex, and so thinking about how do we break this down? Does this need to be, as an instruction to students, does it need to have 6 steps and 4 links in it, or how can we sort of headline that a little bit better, and how can we make it a bit more digestible for folks? How much of the behind the scenes do they really need to understand to just take their own action? And so I think it's that balance of, what's the thorough documentation of what's happening behind the scenes, but really, thinking about who needs to know what, and making sure that that content just gets right to the point for the folks and for the relevant audience that needs it.
Great. Yeah, and somebody had asked this questions. They had to leave a little bit earlier for another meeting. The story of our lives, I think, at this point. This webinar is being recorded, and speaking of accessibility, there will be a full audio transcript available for that one, in addition to a chat relay. So if you do want to either go back and watch this again or refer other colleagues to it, you can use the same link you used to access this live, or you can direct them to the registration page. And once you register, it'll send you to a streamed version of this. So this is being recorded. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I don't know if you guys kind of want to go through this resources page here.
Sure, I can touch on several of these, and Naomi, if you want to jump in ever, feel free. These are the resources that at least I most frequently reference, and we referenced within this presentation as well. The Federal Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, as Naomi mentioned, is what the University of Wisconsin-Madison references when we talk about accessibility, as well as the Americans with Disability Act. One of the easiest ones, I think, for people to use and pinpoint as a resource is the World Wide Web Consortium guidelines. It's very easily searchable on their website, and it is just a great resource to find things pretty quickly. Plain Writing Act of 2010 and Plain Language, so plainlanguage.gov. They've got examples on there of some language that was used and then how it was converted into plain language, and they've got some really great resources. As I mentioned, the Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool is a plugin that you can just, once you've added it as a plugin, you can just click the button and it automatically gives you a summary of how your digital space is or isn't, specifically websites are or are not accessible. So those are just some really easy ones. And then a resource that's not listed on here, but again, I know I'm probably hitting people over the head with this now, but really utilizing your audience as a resource, or people that aren't content experts in what you're trying to present. That's just a great resource as well.
Great. And we do have a question from Ala. She says, thanks for the presentation. And she was wondering if you use the same principles for the internal portal access by enrolled students.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to this unless you'd like to start, Ellen.
No, go ahead, Naomi.
Great. So we have on our campus, and this is a big transition this past year, was moving to a more unified student experience with a lot of folks in our campus IT updating the student portal experience and moving to something that's a bit more responsive and dynamic and user friendly. And accessibility really was a priority throughout the process. So thinking about the different devices folks are using things on, and they also have been engaging both our accessibility lab periodically, as well as myself and other communicators in enrollment management in their ongoing design sprint planning as they continue to refine now that the portal has been launched, as well as anytime they have new development that is definitely baked in. And I think part of the intention in having communicators in the room and part of informing that process is to flag those things, even from tiny things to, oh, this link text, can we switch it to this to keep accessibility in mind, and also baked in at that higher level of how the actual architecture of the card structure and design of the overall portal. So definitely very much a part of the consideration in the student portal. Let's see, Buller.
And to add to that, UW-Madison just this past year wrapped up a lengthy 5 to 3 year process to implement our new student portal. And with that, we removed a lot of the customizations that we had originally had, which made it more accessible automatically and easier to manage. And then also improved usability, which in turn improved accessibility, making it easier to find things. Yes, when we can, we do use many of the same principles and try to have someone on those teams that's considering accessibility and usability when we're implementing and making changes to our internal portals as well.
Great, thanks for the perspective there. So I'm not seeing any other comments or questions coming through. So I just wanted to mention that ACRO is offering a bunch of webinars the rest of this month and in November, some of which on of particular interest to myself anyway, on professional well-being while we're all kind of burned out from COVID and so on and so forth. So definitely take a look at the upcoming webinars for ACRO. But otherwise, just wanted to say thank you to Ellen and Naomi for sharing your perspective here. It's something that probably doesn't get the attention that it should, at least on a regular basis. As you said, a lot of times it's kind of a final check mark after you've done the rest of your development work, rather than something that you focus on from the start through the finish. So hopefully we can get more people interested in thinking about this in the future. I don't know if you had any final remarks or if you just want to wrap it up there.
No, thanks so much for having us. I think again to the point that was brought up before, just that it really is about improved user experience for all, and so not to harp on that too much, but it really is that win across the board. It's not just this accommodating X group. It's really about how can we improve this for everybody and keep some special considerations in mind for folks of all ability levels. So thanks again for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have nothing to add to what Naomi said.
Perfect. All right, well, enjoy the rest of your week. So just one more day until a weekend. We're cooped up at home, or maybe hopefully outside. All right, have a good one, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.